Okay, fantastic. We've got a full program. So welcome everybody to the Council of Graduate Schools webinar, Global Conversations on Postgraduate Education, Exploring Pan-African Connections. We're really excited that this webinar is co-led with the University of Johannesburg and the Community of Practice in Postgraduate Education and Scholarship, Universities, South Africa. So just a couple of technical logistics before we get started with today's event. We do encourage you all to submit questions at any time through the Q&A feature in your Zoom toolbar. We will be answering questions after Chuck Ambler's presentation, as well as at the end of the roundtable portion of today's event. A reminder that the recording, as well as the presentation slides, will be emailed to all registrants, as well as posted to the CGS website after the live event. And we try to do this within a week of the live event taking place. The chat today is available to all attendees, and we do encourage conversation in the chat, but do remember, if you are going to submit questions for the presenters, please do so in the Q&A feature of the Zoom toolbar. And so with that, I'd like to hand the presentation over for moderation to Janet Rutledge, Vice Provost and Dean of the Graduate School at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Janet, the floor is yours.
Well, good morning, everyone, to my colleagues who are in the United States and Canada, and a very early good morning to those on the West Coast, and a good afternoon to my colleagues in South Africa and in Egypt and Ghana and the rest of the African continent. We're looking forward to a lively discussion at this session, and we're looking forward to your participation. First, I would like to introduce our meeting co-host, Suzanne Ortega, who's president of the U.S. Council of Graduate Schools, Shireen Motala from the University of Johannesburg, and Stephanie Burton, chairperson of the Community of Practice in Postgraduate Education and Scholarship in the University of South Africa. Dr. Ortega has served as president of the U.S. Council of Graduate Schools since 2014. The Council of Graduate Schools is an organization of approximately 500 institutions of higher education in the United States and Canada, engaged in graduate education, research, and the preparation of candidates for advanced degrees. The organization's mission is to improve and advance graduate education, which it accomplishes through advocacy in the federal policy arena, research, and the development and dissemination of best practices. Dr. Ortega is a leader in graduate education in the US and is called upon to speak and serve on panels around the world. She has served as a university professor, dean, provost, and is an expert on mental health epidemiology, health services, and race and ethnic relations. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ortega.
Janet, thanks so much for that kind introduction, and colleagues, it's terrific to have you all join us. As you heard Janet mention, I have the privilege of serving as president of the Council of Graduate Schools, the only U.S. institution organization devoted specifically to advancing practice and quality of programming in postgraduate education. I think I would like to give a little additional context. CGS has, in its origin, been focused in North America, but at least since the early years of its founding, it has had a significant international mission. For 30 years, from 1963 to 1995, the Council of Graduate Schools, with the funding from the USAID, and in collaboration with additional partners, was primarily responsible for the administration of a program called AFGRAD, which provided higher postgraduate education support to African scholars from more than 45 countries, and 3,000 AFGRAD alums currently are serving in leadership roles across the continent and indeed the world. In addition, for the last 15 years, we have been deeply interested in broadening connections to our colleagues throughout the globe, and have done so, I think, reaching out to our colleagues such as Adham and Shireen and others through a series of convenings. But for the last 5 years, we've really been focused on the question of how do we expand our connections to the global South, recognizing that a truly robust conversation informed by the diversity of experiences, institutional and national, depends upon broader participation. And so it was approximately 2.5 years ago, and you will hear from my colleague, Chuck Ambler. Chuck came to join us at CGS to launch a process that explores the strengths and the mechanisms for creating a Pan-African network, one also connected to the US and Canada. So we're going to hear from Chuck. I'm absolutely delighted that Janet has agreed to serve as a chair of an advisory committee that's helping us think through how we can best advance our common purposes. And I am absolutely thrilled to join Shireen and Stephanie today in what we hope will be the first of a number of conversations. So Janet, thank you for your introductions. Colleagues, thank you for being with us. We are truly looking forward to a rich conversation.
Thank you, Suzanne. And now it's my pleasure to introduce a co-host from the University of Johannesburg, Shireen Motala. Professor Motala is currently the head of the Postgraduate School at the University of Johannesburg and a professor in the Faculty of Education. Professor Motala holds the South African Research Chair in Teaching and Learning and is funded by the Department of Science and Technology, administered by the National Research Foundation, and hosted at the University of Johannesburg. The primary focus of the research program is teaching and learning in higher education, and particularly the interrelated subfields of academic learning, academic teaching, and student learning, together with knowledge, curricular, and other enablers of access and student success across undergraduate and postgraduate studies. Please join me in welcoming Professor Motala.
Thanks very much, Janet. It's great to be here. And I want to start off by just acknowledging, the role of the CGS in convening this important conversation, but also to acknowledge in particular the role of Suzanne Ortega in her leadership of this initiative, and also Brian Mitchell, who is the Dean in Residence at the CGS, who's been central to getting us to this point. So I want to just say a few words quickly about the Saatchi Chair, Teaching and Learning at the University of Johannesburg. These chairs are nationally established chairs which work in a variety of disciplines, and mine focuses on teaching and learning in higher education. And the relevance of my presence here today is one of the themes of the chair is on access and success in postgraduate education and issues of the scholarship of teaching and learning, with a particular focus on higher education. So over time, there have been key partnerships. In 2016, I think we hosted a very successful Council of Graduate Schools Summit with Suzanne and other colleagues. And that initiated the thinking that Suzanne has alerted us to about what about strengthening global partnerships, particularly in the South and with the Pan-African focus. I'm sure many of these issues that are on the screen will be the subject of discussion today, but I think across the North and the South, there are 3 or 4 big issues that continue to confront us, and certainly in the South African context. The one is the issue of scale and quality. The other is the issue of sufficient and adequate resource allocation, what works in terms of support. And finally, the issues of the pedagogy of supervision. And in the last couple of years, how have we managed postgraduate education during COVID-19? So the overall focus of the chair, which aligns very clearly with the work of the CGS, is on policymaking, contributing to discourses and debates, trying to strategize together collectively across continents around the visible contribution content, actions, and finally, together to find a way of contributing to scholarship, practical actions in a global South and in a Pan-African context through enhanced partnerships. As you know, in every context, there are very particularities around issues. And in the South African context in 2015 and 2016, we had a set of protests, and it highlighted two issues which I think are very relevant to postgraduate education. The one was the issue of curriculum reform and what is now discussed and under much investigation around the decolonization of this curriculum. And the second was around resource allocation, which affects both postgraduate and undergraduate students in different ways in the South African context. And these are some of the thinkings and the scholarship that emerged from that. But these are ongoing debates in South Africa. The chair works in a number of areas. The one is similar to what Prof. Ambler is going to present. It's about the size and shape of postgraduate studies, a situation analysis. Others relate to supervision models, issues of decolonization, thinking through the doctoral process, and more recently, a set of international collaborative efforts, both with Global South partners and North partners, and partners in Australia, looking at areas related to doctoral education. Finally, just by way of conclusion, my last slide, I'm excited and pleased to be part of this initiative. And really it's about building, I think we've identified the domain as education research and higher education, scholarship and practice. We want to build communities of practice and global networks. And we want to do this. The audience today is an important constituent within this effort. And what would we like to do? It's about collaboration. It's about sharing knowledge, a best practice around scholarly engagement through our relationships in a South-South manner, but also in a North-South manner. And for us in particular, and relevant to the topic today, is the issue of Pan-African partnerships. Thanks very much, colleagues. Look forward to a good engagement.
Thank you, Shireen. Our next co-host is Stephanie Burton, who is chairperson of the Community of Practice in Postgraduate Education and Scholarship at the Universities South Africa. The Universities South Africa membership comprises 26 public universities distributed across all 9 provinces in South Africa. Members help to promote best interests of South African universities. The purpose of this community of practice is to bring together all of the national expertise and national interest in postgraduate education and scholarship to improve and enhance the experience of their postgraduates. Professor Burton is a professor of chemistry and the former vice principal for research and postgraduate education at the University of Pretoria. She was also instrumental in setting up the Africa Research Universities Alliance, a network of 16 leading African universities. Please join me in welcoming Professor Motala. I'm sorry, Professor Burton.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation to be a part of this meeting. And thank you also to Shireen for including me in all of this. So let me set the context for my position in this. I am, as you've just said, a professor at one of the universities, but my role here is as a research fellow for Universities South Africa, which is the association of all the public universities in South Africa. And the work that I'm representing here is hosted and supported by Universities South Africa, and in turn supported by our National Department of Science and Innovation. And it comes from the context of a project that was done during 2020-21 about how we best can build our cohort of emerging scholars in our higher education system. That was a long project where we did a great deal of data collection, and out of it came some recommendations, one of which was that we need a sector-wide strategy group or community of practice which focuses on postgraduate education and supervision and how we develop our early career researchers. So that's the context of it. In the implementation of all of that, we started discussing a national strategy group, but we moved on to the idea of a community of practice for a number of reasons, which are mostly about inclusiveness. So we see this community of practice as being a forum for sharing best practice and a think tank. Also an opportunity to lobby, and I'll say a little more about that in a moment, to advocate for postgraduate education matters in the national sector. We have a task of coordinating national activities, and I'll say more about that in a moment. And then we are a national platform for discussion and interaction and recommendations. And we have at the moment a role of bringing in participating universities and facilitating collaboration between all of the different universities. So let me just say what we think a community of practice is. It's a group of concerned individuals or groups of institutions who share concerns and challenges and problems and an interest, which is about deepening knowledge and expertise. But it also is a way of facilitating learning, and it can be acknowledged as a part of an organizational development. And that we see as very important in our context, that we have a network of all our universities, and we can bring that to the attention of our university organizations management through the community of practice activities. So the normal structure for a community of practice is that there's a core group, a coordinator or chair, and a small steering committee. At the moment, I'm the chair of the community of practice, and we have a small group of interested individuals who are the steering group. And then we have a broad group of participants who are from many sources, but largely from the academia and research management and postgraduate development sectors. We also are developing a knowledge repository where we can place resources. So we've started this by looking at the areas of probably greatest concern, which are around supervision for not just supervision of postgraduates, but the training of supervisors and the equipping of supervisors to be experts in how to manage postgraduate training. And then mentorship, which is really a very important aspect also for the emerging academics as much as for the postgraduate students. So those are two very key areas where we see that we need to develop resources and support systems. So what are we looking for? Well, the activities of the community of practice at the moment are about compiling information on what we have in our universities already and where there are gaps in individual institutions and where we can support that, and then of course across the whole sector. So we're looking at support for training supervisors, we're looking at developing postgraduate supervision models. We also are focusing on teaching and learning and doctorateness and theoretical approaches. And then, of course, some of the practical issues around postgraduate education, which are about resourcing the postgraduates as much as the institutions, and then the accountability for postgraduate training and coordinating all of those different activities. And this afternoon is exactly one of those examples where we can coordinate between our community of practice and this webinar. And the members of our community of practice have been invited to join this system here. So I will stop there. There's a great deal more we can say. And we do have a website which is just being launched today, and that has a little more information on it, but I'd be happy to discuss this further. I think as we get into the discussions during the course of the day. Suffice at this stage is to say that we see this as something in which all of the participants, our members of the community of practice, have the opportunity to reach out into this network through our community of practice and to build the networks across the continent and, as you say, between the North and the South as we develop. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Burton. As you can see in the chat, we have participants from a wide variety of countries, and it's quite exciting to see that. You will be hearing more from our three co-hosts when we get to the roundtable discussion. But as you can see that they are each involved in some very important activities that are helping support graduate education around the world. We're going to move into a presentation now from Professor Charles Ambler. He is a professor of history at the University of Texas in El Paso. He is going to talk to us about postgraduate education in Africa, challenges and prospects. His research has focused on 19th and 20th century Africa. He has been a visiting scholar at the University of Oxford, the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, a visiting professor at the University of Zambia and at Nairobi University. In 2010, he was the president of the African Studies Association. He has taught courses on African history and the history of empire. He formerly served as Dean of the Graduate School at the University of Texas, El Paso. And as Suzanne mentioned earlier, he served for a year as Dean in Residence at the U.S. Council of Graduate Schools, where he launched some of the projects that we're currently working on in reaching out and creating partnerships with universities in Africa. So without further ado, I will turn the floor over to Professor Ambler.
Hello, everyone. And we can move on to the next slide there. Today's overview talk on postgraduate education in sub-Saharan Africa is based on a paper that I completed in August of 2020, now almost 2 years ago, when I was the Dean in Residence at the Council of Graduate Schools. And for anyone who's interested in seeing the complete paper, getting the references and so forth, please feel free to contact me or the CGS, and we'll be happy to send you along a copy. Being a historian, of course, I need to focus on the history of postgraduate education and higher education generally in the continent. And I do so because I think it continues to have a compelling impact on education today. The colonial heritage continues to exercise considerable impact on the development of postgraduate education. For two fundamental reasons. The first is that under colonial rule, there was very, very little attention paid to higher education and almost none to postgraduate education. And in many cases, at the time of independence, there were even very few people who had higher education degrees. And that may seem like a long time ago, but of course, in terms of the careers of even individual people, it is not. And the second impact is that as universities began to develop, they tended to follow the models of the former colonial ruling country, whether France or Britain or Portugal, etc. With independence, though, African countries set off in a flurry of higher education development, and universities were seen as hugely important engines for research for development, both social and economic. And at the same time, too, there was rethinking the question of what a university and a university education should look like. Should it not be rooted in African culture and African particular needs? Early echoes, if you like, of the issues of decolonizing education that Shireen earlier referred to. And national universities were established across the continent, and considerable resources in the 1960s in particular were dedicated to them. And at some of the premier institutions, like the University of Nigeria at Ibadan, like the University of Ghana, Dakar, Nairobi, Dar es Salaam, strong graduate programs were instituted, typically, in many cases, in African studies areas. Unfortunately, by the end of the 1960s and into the early 1970s, political instability and authoritarianism combined with dramatic global economic shocks to pull the rug out from under the development of higher education, and what revenues there were devoted to other more pressing needs in many cases. Leadership was hostile to higher education. And so the development seemingly so promising in the 1960s was effectively halted. As African countries sought to restart their economies. They turned to external support, and particularly the IMF. And they rapidly, in the late 70s and early 1980s, came under the IMF neoliberal economic regime. And in country after country, so-called structural adjustment programs were established, ultimately with quite mixed, but nevertheless, very important results. These were designed to stimulate market forces and business growth, to dramatically shrink public sectors, to privatize aspects of government agencies, and in particular to reduce investment in all kinds of so-called social spending, which certainly included higher education, let alone postgraduate education. And we see the evidence of that shift in the World Bank, for example, that moved its interests away from higher education, which had been very strong, to other kinds of emphases. Beginning in the 1990s, though, there was another profound shift, with African economies rising and economic growth becoming more important. There was investment to be had, and a growing and perceived need for highly trained professionals and research, especially applied research, that would stimulate further economic growth. And this was compounded as well by the developments in South Africa, which I'll come back to, when in 1994, the country moved to majority rule. There was also a huge demographic driver here, with an emerging university-age population and an enormous boom in demand for university education. Could I have the next slide? Postgraduate education, as I've noted, was relatively limited, with a few small PhD programs which languished in the circumstances that I have discussed. There were master's degrees across the board, and now some movement towards professional masters. In general, there was an assumption that if people were going to go for PhD study, they best do that in North America or in Europe. As the numbers in particular that received degrees in the United States increased, we also begin to see an emerging influence of American models of higher education competing with those from especially Britain and France. There was growing investment in universities to meet especially undergraduate demand, but this was, of course, a game of playing catch up across the continent because there had been so much underfunding for so long. A dramatic expansion in the size of universities and also in the numbers, although this varies somewhat from country to country. Nevertheless, these institutions continued to be under-resourced and complicated by larger social and economic issues. For example, practically speaking, insufficiency of power grids, bandwidth, and so forth. But at the same time, these institutions were seen as extremely important, providing basic higher education needs, and of course, research as well. And in particular, there was growing pressure to provide research that directly related to economic development. Now, just very briefly, and apologies to my South African colleagues for whom this will be nothing new. Obviously, higher education in South Africa took followed a different pattern in some ways. It is rooted in the apartheid higher education system that existed through the 1980s. And that involved the development of a number of really world competitive institutions that were almost entirely devoted to educating white students and involved largely white faculty. A network of, as apartheid evolved, a network of institutions was developed to serve, in quotes, the Black communities, although of course, fundamentally they served the apartheid system, providing a kind of education that was seen as appropriate to sustaining that system. After 1994, there was certainly an enormous press for equity and enormous change. If you look at the statistics, you see dramatic rises in the number of Black students going to university, dramatic increases in the number of faculty, and so forth. But it has nevertheless proved extremely difficult for the system as a whole to break out of that apartheid heritage. And the so-called former white institutions continue to dominate, especially in the areas of research and in postgraduate education. And as in the face of economic challenges, the press for equity has somewhat faded against rising emphasis on research and economic development that can sustain economic growth. I should note here too, in general, in compiling this overview, I encountered a limited amount of data available. First of all, relatively little scholarship, especially outside of South Africa. And then as well, uneven access and quality of original data on things like enrollments, characteristics of enrollment, and so forth. We can move to the next slide. In general, although we heard in the introductions some evidence of very, very exciting and promising changes, there has been until quite recently very little in the way of kind of organized constituency building for postgraduate education. And so when asking this question, who is speaking for postgraduate education? The answer has been, generally speaking, almost no one. And that's, of course, an important question because it relates to the larger question of competition over resources. And with populations booming, demand for undergraduate education dramatic, all kinds of competing calls on government investment, it can be extremely difficult, as all postgraduate education leaders know, to make the case for postgraduate education. As elsewhere, faculty retirements and university expansion has very much dramatically increased the demand for trained faculty in universities, which in turn leads to a demand, of course, for postgraduate education. Like many universities across the global South, many universities in Africa, including South Africa, have a high proportion of faculty who do not have training to the PhD level. And in general, there's a highly variable situation. Of course, South Africa tends to be a relatively different situation than the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. I'm not talking here about North Africa, but in the roundtable, we'll hear more about that, but that has a distinctive history as well. But even within sub-Saharan Africa, outside of South Africa, there's a great deal of difference. For example, in Kenya, which is the country as a scholar I have focused on, even before the pandemic, a scandal had emerged in the local press about the quality of education generally in the country, and in particular focusing on postgraduate education and the quality of doctoral education. And indeed, there were predictions that universities actually faced bankruptcy. Now, against this, where I've been talking mostly about public universities, there's also been huge growth in private universities, an area which covers a wide range of types of institutions, of course, from fundamentally sort of tech training schools, kind of fly-by-night institutions, to extremely well-funded, very large and impressive institutions, notably in West Africa, in Nigeria, and in Ghana especially. And there's the case, for example, of Covenant University in Nigeria, which by some assessments is now the leading institution in Nigeria in terms of research, although, of course, there's debate about whether that is the case. Certainly, in a broader sense, there is growing recognition of the need for PhDs, certainly to press urgent research needs, but simply to provide the teaching bodies to serve undergraduate populations. But where is the investment for that? And there is the research expectation. Knowledge and education for national development is certainly a key policy initiative, and increasingly the development of postgraduate education rhetoric is very much framed inside of a framework of the notion of advanced economies, technology, and so forth, the knowledge economy, if you like. The next slide. We don't know a great deal about, except in a certain specific places in general, to build a kind of assessment of PhD and other postgraduate education. But I did want to draw listeners' attention to the 2018 available online British Council German Academic Exchange Service study that looked at PhD programs in 6 countries in Africa and made some larger conclusions based on those. Now, reflecting in part the unevenness of available data and the nature of the educational systems in those countries, the report itself is somewhat uneven, but it does have some clear findings. There is, first of all, the need for expanding PhD production, countering explicitly this kind of underlying sense that PhD instruction should really occur elsewhere. But clearly insufficient institutional infrastructure, and also the need for new kinds of models of PhD training in particular, and especially advocating for collaborative kinds of models. I have cited up there on the screen a very important report and study from South Africa, which actually has findings which are not dissimilar from the DAD British Council study, except that the South African higher educational system is far better funded. Certainly there has been considerable research success in South Africa, but the infrastructure is arguably inadequate to meet the ambitious goals for research and for the expansion, ambitious expansion of the production of PhD graduates. Next slide. What key issues have been emerging as postgraduate education has in the last 2 or 3 decades become increasingly important? Well, these are not unfamiliar to postgraduate education leaders anywhere. First of all, the fundamental one of, does postgraduate education pay off, either in an individual sense or in the larger sense of social development? And of course, this is extremely important issue in cases where resources are so tight. Should the development of postgraduate education focus on the best funded, most prestigious and well-known institution, or as higher education expands, should it be more distributed? And perhaps most importantly, and of course we heard this alluded to in the very exciting new developments that are taking place, discussions in South Africa, are existing models of PhD training in any sense sustainable? And if they're not, this kind of one-on-one model in circumstances where research active PhD faculty are in very short supply, and the need for more PhD graduates is so pressing, what are the alternatives? Next slide, and final slide. We went backwards there. Okay, thanks. Now, there are a number of initiatives up there that I want to draw your attention to, but as my time is at an end, I'm only going to very briefly reference them. First of all, there is the Pan-African University, which began in 2010, but in the last few years has really begun to expand. It's a multi-campus kind of institution, and it sort of sets the model for what these initiatives really suggest. And these are, first of all, a focus on particular important, necessary, if you like, particular subject areas, typically in the sciences, agriculture, and so forth. And the other aspect of them is that they are collaborative. They're not just based in a single institution, but they involve important linkages. You can take a look at some of the other examples there, but I should underscore the relatively recent World Bank Centers of Excellence, which began in 2014, and in terms of funds invested, overshadows all of the others. And it has now reached 58 institutions, with more coming on. By 2019, there were 10,000 master's students enrolled in the various programs, and 2,400 in PhD programs. And this, like the others, involves this kind of mix of focus on particular subject areas where there is identifiable strength, and the building of linkages across different institutions and programs to provide that kind of basis of support. I think the big question that remains as I close is, although these kind of initiatives provide very important models for thinking about the future of postgraduate education, in and of themselves, they probably don't begin to be sufficiently scalable. For example, in Nigeria in recent years, there have been more than 250,000 students enrolled in postgraduate studies at 75 different universities. And programs that don't really begin to think along the lines that they're talking about in South Africa of innovative approaches to postgraduate education on individual campuses across disciplines are not going to begin to meet the needs. Thank you very much, and I'll of course be happy to entertain any questions.
Thank you, Chuck. We have two questions that are in the chat and in the Q&A tab, and they're both very challenging questions. So they are really questions that are pretty global, I would say, in their reach. So the first one says, yes, indeed, Africa needs more PhDs. Considering the uncertainty in Africa, is there a strategy to rescue graduate students and their mentors at risk?
That is a profound question. Now, I will say, of course, that I'm a historian, right? So I look back rather than forward, but that even provides us with some insight there. I think what this underscores is some of the challenges that thinking about postgraduate education in the global South represent, but also can apply in a broader context as well. That we have to think about how programs that are blithely invested in and so on may endure, and how the people that are involved in them can be protected in cases of economic or political or whatever the stresses might be. And I think, though, in a larger sense, this does point back to the whole point of this workshop, this webinar, and to the CGS initiative and to the other initiatives I alluded to, which is the strategy of embedding postgraduate education in new models of collaboration, so that there are alternatives for people when things go south, go wrong in some particular situation. But of course, the other panelists later on may wish to chime in on this.
Yes, I think several of these questions will probably be good areas for our panelists later on. I will go to the second one, and that is, how do we evaluate the effectiveness of our PhD program? Are they really making a difference in the fields they research, or just a PhD on the shelf?
Right. Well, this gets to that fundamental question of whether these are worth it. And this really was at the root of the sort of public press scandal that surfaced in Kenya around postgraduate education, whether some of these degrees really had involved very significant work, and whether the outcomes of them were at all important. I mean, I think this gets back to some of the questions that this project is about building communities of practice, communities of interest around postgraduate education in African countries, across regions in Africa, to develop the kinds of standards and mechanisms for assessment that can ensure that private and public investments in postgraduate education are well placed.
Thank you. The next question is, in terms of development in sub-Saharan Africa, do you think vocational and skills training should receive more emphasis than the PhD?
Well, that again, historically has been a fundamental question. And as a historian of Africa, my initial response to that is that any highly talented individual living anywhere should have, we hope, the opportunity to fulfill their dreams, but also to their talent in terms of contributing to not just the needs of their home areas, but also to global knowledge. And but in any case, I don't think that the trade-off is necessarily an absolute one, because in the long run, I don't think it's possible to have really effective sort of ground level training, even down into elementary school, if you don't have the entire system of higher education in place that ensures, for example, that those programs are effective, that they're the right ones. In earlier decades in African societies and states, external experts were relied upon to ensure these things, with often disastrous results. And so a more integrated approach, which involves local knowledge and trained local personnel, I think across the board, is more likely to have a longer term impact. Now, it's still, of course, a very hard question to answer when you're talking about very limited resources and having to make hard decisions about how to spend them.
Our next question is, are there any data available on the numbers of PhDs produced in the last few years? Is there any visible trend?
That, of course, is a question that I alluded to in the issue of data. There's no continental-wide set of data. So really the only way that you can get at some of those questions is to assemble that information country by country. Some countries have very good sets of data, although much more limited than one might see in the United States or in Europe. But others really, it even has to be pieced together in the country itself. So I think the one thing that we can certainly say is that there has been very impressive growth. Nigeria, for example, does have pretty strong data. They have a centralized system of university management, and they do collect very important information. So there's certainly this this growth, but in terms of really being able to see, and of course there's a focus on investments, and this is especially notable in South Africa, more on the STEM side and the social sciences, where investments can pay off in terms of economic development and in particular training people that are very needed for urgent social or economic tasks. But beyond that, not yet.
We just have time for a few more questions, and then we'll have to move on to our panel. The next question says, I concur that the DAAD has broadened the scope by offering postgraduate scholarships in Africa, and I was a recipient of the CERM ESA DAAD PhD scholarship from 2019 to 2021. My question is, how can PhD graduates who want to extend their studies through projects be assisted? Yes, there is the NRF in South Africa, but the application process for an emerging graduate is comprehensive. This is a multi-part question. How can this initiative of today help to close this funding gap or to help to present opportunities?
Well, I think what this initiative could especially do is to bring together people across countries, regions, the continent, to move discussions forward on kinds of promising practices. But it's an extremely difficult one, which is highly amplified, but is not, of course, unknown in postgraduate education and postdoc education in Europe and America. So it's a very significant one. I might point to the model for humanities, which of course I'm a little more aware of, which has been funded over the years by the Carnegie Foundation, used with the ACLS, and they've had a system in place of fellowships for PhD students and postdocs who are training in African countries. And this has been going on for a number of years with a series of workshops and relatively modest, but very significant investments. And this has led in the last couple of years now to the formation of an African humanities organization that is pulling together humanities scholars across the continent. And some of these kinds of scholarly organizations, for example, in the area of mathematics or in agriculture or in economics, I think are some of the most promising models to lay on top of some of these other initiatives we've been talking about.
So this question follows up on this same line of discussion a bit. Are we considering affordability and sponsorship? How? What are the possibilities of cross-border supervision of graduate students in Africa?
Well, I mean, of course, we're considering it. I did not really talk directly about this issue of student support, but I probably should have. And this is a fundamental one, and was very much in the scandal that emerged in Kenya, kind of came very, very bluntly to the surface. But it's really characteristic across the continent. The amounts of money being provided to students are inadequate, of course. So students, very high proportions of students, even in PhD programs, are working at the same time that they're getting their degrees. And we know that this is not really sustainable. And so other kinds of models like these shared responsibility ones, which link different universities across regions, perhaps within countries, with universities in Europe or North America. And there are already some very important initiatives along these lines, but it continues to be extremely challenging. One development that is disturbing is even in South Africa, where there's typically been substantial investment from the private sector, from industry, in higher education, of course, to meet their own needs for research and development and so on. This has tended to shrink up in recent years as consolidation of corporate entities has occurred, and there are fewer and fewer and fewer corporate headquarters located in South Africa, anywhere on the continent, really, as the parent companies tend to be elsewhere. One thing also I didn't really touch on is the growing role of China in funding elements of higher education. They have emerged as the leading country to provide scholarships before the pandemic, of course. So the direction that is going to go as we emerge in the post-pandemic period will be interesting to document.
And one final question that was in the chat. Other than the curriculum and educational systems and policies, either related to colonialization or not, what other factors do you think are responsible for the current education in Africa?
Well, I mean, I hope that in a sense was what I was talking about. Clearly, one thing that a fundamental issue that one needs to always keep in mind is that these larger, especially economic trends, are often amplified in their impact on countries which have weaker economies, and so I think overall that's the largest thing. Clearly, African universities are still very much impacted by the decades of underfunding and even public hostility, which occurred during the 1970s and 80s and into the 1990s even. And so that's a very important factor. But on a kind of positive side, one thing that has emerged in the context of the pandemic is much more of a comfort with these kinds of virtual interactions. We would still like to meet in person, of course, but the possibilities there in terms of working with students, groups of faculty working together, notions of building postgraduate education community and around all kinds of issues with higher education, I think have the possibilities have become much more exciting.
Thank you very much for sharing this history and for answering these very difficult questions. I think that you have done an outstanding job of seeding the discussion and really helping us to focus on some of the topics that are what brought us here to begin with. So,
and thanks very much to all of you who took time out of your day to participate in this.
There were a few questions that went unanswered, but I think that those questions can be carried over into our roundtable discussion. So they are not lost. I didn't miss them, but we need to move on to the next segment of our program. So thank you very much, Chuck. Next, we have a roundtable discussion with a distinguished group of panelists representing West, South, and North Africa. One of our panelists also has some experience in East Africa. I believe that Professor Robert Darko Asseyi may be having trouble getting connected. So I don't know if he is on yet. So I will come back to introducing him if so I hear he's not on yet. I will go on to our other panelists. We have Professor Fulu Godfrey Netswira, who is the Executive Dean of the Faculty of Management Sciences at the Durban University of Technology in South Africa. Professor Fulu is a former associate professor at the Tshwane University of Technology in South Africa, and also at the Uganda Technology and Management University. So he has some experience in Uganda. He's had visiting research fellowships at the City University of New York in the USA and at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. Professor Fulu has held a variety of leadership positions in the South African higher education sector, including but not limited to directing the South African BRICS think tank, vice chairperson of the South African Business Schools Association. He has published extensively in higher education management, governance, entrepreneurship, and philanthropy. He has been recently appointed to a visiting professorship at Lincoln International Business School in the United Kingdom. Please join me in welcoming Professor Fulu. Our other panelist is Adham Ramadan, Associate Provost for Research and Dean of Graduate Studies at the American University in Cairo, Egypt. Professor Ramadan is a professor of chemistry. His research expertise lies in the field of nanoporous materials. His work primarily falls within two areas of applications: drug delivery and environmental applications. He has prior experience in the Egyptian Environmental Affairs Agency and the Ministry of State for Environmental Affairs and in private environmental consulting. He has been involved in some national and international initiatives concerned with the environmental management at large and with emphasis on the management of hazardous substances and waste. And as I said, he is the Associate Provost for Research and Dean of Graduate Studies at the American University in Cairo. And our third panelist who could not be here, Robert Darko Asseyi from the University of Ghana, who's Dean of the School of Graduate Studies. If he's able to join us, we will bring him onto the panel. If not, we will.
I am here.
Oh.
I am here as Joseph.
Oh, I see. Wonderful. Okay. Professor Asseyi, welcome. Glad you could join us. He is a professor in the Institute of Statistical, Social, and Economic Research at the University of Ghana in Legon. And I said he was Dean of the School of Graduate Studies. And he's published widely in edited volumes and top international journals. His main areas of research include evaluative poverty and rural research, macro and micro implications of fiscal policies, aid effectiveness, and other economic development policy concerns. He is currently involved in a number of research projects in Ghana, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali. So please welcome our panel. We have a number of questions for our panelists, and the first question is going to come from Suzanne Ortega. Suzanne.
Thanks so much, Janet, and thanks to panelists and our participants in the webinar. I thought it would be useful to get started with our discussion by simply asking our panelists to give a little bit of context for their perspective, the lens with which they approach postgraduate education, and to do so by telling us a little bit about their university, students, range of programs, but then to situate their particular university in their understanding of the larger postgraduate landscape that characterizes their country or their region. We're so glad, Dr. Asseyi, that you are with us, and we will start with you, and then I would ask that we move Prof. Fulu to you and Dean Ramadan, last but definitely not least, to tackle that question. Tell us a little bit about your university and then place your university's postgraduate education in the context of the nation. And I would, if your cameras aren't on, I strongly encourage all of us to put our cameras on so we can have more of a conversation. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So I get to start, right?
Yes.
Let me begin by saying a good afternoon and sorry, I was having serious challenges trying to get connected, but I'm here. I think that's what matters. Okay, so the University of Ghana is the premier university in Ghana with currently over 53,000 students generally, but the graduate students make up close to 14%. So we're roughly around 7,500 graduate students, of which about 1,500 or so are PhDs. Generally, for graduate programs, we have over 300 programs that run in 4 colleges here at the universities. These colleges essentially are, of course, in sciences and humanities, and then 1 college in education. Now, in terms of our typical graduate students, largely many of them are self-financing, even for the PhD students, and I think probably 95% are self-financing. In the last 10 or so years, we've had quite a number of supports and the setting up of these centers of excellence, which come with some financing. And so increasingly, we are getting quite a bit of resources to support PhD training, but it's very biased towards the sciences. The university generally has a vision of becoming a research-intensive university, and the aim is to position itself to train more research, or in fact more PhDs, so that they can then go out and then also support other universities, because there is a lot of private universities that are springing up in the country. And of course, what that has meant is that the graduate school has been tasked to essentially drive the university's effort at moving our percentage from the current 13 or so percent to I mean, a very ambitious ratio of 50% graduate students to 50% undergraduate students. Clearly, we are nowhere near that level, and it requires significant effort at doing that. But at least there is support, and the current general trends in some of the initiatives which are ongoing, particularly the African Research Universities Alliance, gives us a bit of a platform to try and then take advantage of doing a bit more training in respect of the PhDs and in respect of the trajectory that we currently are on as a university. So this is where we are broadly from the University of Ghana's perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. Prof. Bulu?
Okay, thank you very much, Suzanne. Now, perhaps let me start by indicating that the South African higher education system is one that is defined as a differentiated higher education system. At think there's some background noise. Joseph, if you can mute. Yeah, thank you very much. So as I was saying, the South African higher education system is one that is defined as a differentiated higher education system, emanating out of the White Paper on Higher Education, 1997, which intended to rationalize this system through measures of universities. And out of that process, 3 institutional types emerged, being universities of technologies, of which we are one, comprehensive universities and traditional universities, from 27 universities down to 23 universities. Now, you will agree with me that South African population has grown tremendously over the years. We're sitting currently at around 60 million plus of population with only 26 universities. The 3 new universities are very new and very small. All of them are not even the size of my faculty. They are still very young. Now, I own a university, the Durban University of Technology, comprises 6 faculties. We've got the faculties of management sciences, applied sciences, engineering, arts, and health sciences. And by and large, all universities of technology, you will realize have got more or less the same faculty types. The Durban University of Technology currently on annual average accommodates around 33,000 students or so. That is in line with our enrollment target. There are quite a lot of challenges, I must say. Some of those challenges are that universities of technologies are supposed to prioritize technology areas such as engineering and the built environment, applied sciences, and health sciences to some extent, but it is extremely difficult to get the numbers. Now, I sit in a forum of the deans of management sciences, and we just report on some of these numbers when we do meet. And I can tell you that South African universities of technologies are not driving research in that focus as much as we ordinarily should. Now, the other big challenge associated with research and the culture of research in the universities of technology is that as we transcend from being technicals into universities of technology, the skills base of our academic staff members had been generally very low, very poor. And our focus, first and foremost, has been to upgrade the skills of our faculty. So if I give you an example, the DUT last year had to retrench a sizable number of staff members who did not hold master's qualifications. And those were individuals who migrated from the old institution into the current, its current version. We are pushing hard. There are challenges of supervision and so on, which I will allude to later on, but we are pushing hard. Just to give you some interesting statistics, of the 33,000 average student population that we have, postgraduate, which is master's and doctoral, constitute only 8%. That means we are very young in terms of postgraduate studies. We also graduate on average around 300 plus annually. In the grand scheme of things, that is minuscule. The top South African universities, the 12 top research universities, graduate much more than just that. And also to indicate, which I think is important, that South Africa, as a South African higher education sector, produces on average 54 PhD per million population. We are hoping that, and this is articulated also in the National Development Plan, that by 2030 we will have doubled that particular number and be able to produce at least 100 PhDs per million population. Let me stop there, and hopefully I've covered all the issues pertinent to your question. Thank you very much, Susan.
Thank you so much. Adham, we'll go to you next.
Yes, thank you very much for having me on this panel. So basically, the American University in Cairo is a small private international university in Egypt, whose language of instruction, or the language of instruction, is English. So the American University, AUC, was established in 1919. So we recently celebrated our centennial anniversary. Within the overall, maybe I'll start with the overall context of higher education in Egypt. So in Egypt, there are different types of institutions of higher education, universities. There are governmental universities. There are 27 governmental universities, and typically these are very large. There are 36 private universities, and these vary between not-for-profit national universities to for-profit private universities. AUC is one of 2 international universities. It's the oldest. It's the 3rd oldest university in Egypt. Cairo University was established about a decade before AUC, and of course Azhar University has been around since about the 9th century. So there are, in higher education, there are about 3 million students in Egypt nationally, and around 450,000 graduate students. So within that large context, the American University is a small institution. We have about 7,000 students in total. We have around 1,200 graduate students, most of whom are master's students. We historically have been a master's, an undergraduate and a master's degree university, master's program university. We introduced PhD programs 12 years ago in 2010 in sciences and in engineering. We're working on plans to actually possibly introduce other PhD programs in disciplines that are not in sciences and engineering. We have 50 master's programs and 2 PhD programs. These really vary in range in different disciplines. We have 4 schools: global affairs and public policy, science and engineering, humanities and social sciences, as well as business. Typically, we have about 300 graduating students, conference of degrees per year, about 20 of which are 20 PhD students that complete their degrees. Typically, when we look at our student population, I mean, we're a very small university institution within the Egyptian context. But the uniqueness of our position is the age, then the role we play in the Egyptian landscape. We are the primary English language institution in Egypt. We're the only institution that offers a US-style education, undergraduate and graduate. We're the only one accredited in the US. And typically, at the postgraduate level, we attract Egyptian and international students. Our international student body is about 15% lower than what we hope it should be. But 70% of our graduate students at AUC come from national universities and governmental universities. So typically, we actually serve as a platform for students from national universities to actually come and conduct their graduate studies in an English language speaking university. The main challenge we face in recruiting students or having students is the English language requirement. So, I mean, Arabic is the official language in Egypt, is the mother tongue of the majority of Egyptian population. So English is a second language, and this is an attractive point for potential students to come to the American university, but then it is a challenge for students to actually be able to meet the English language requirements. We do offer remedial English courses, language courses, etc. But again, it is one of the issues. Being a private university, it is tuition-based. It's a tuition-based model. So tuition fees are also another challenge to students who would like to join us, even though we actually offer a wide range of fellowships at university, fellowship support at university. We have about 65% of our graduate student population receiving either complete or partial tuition support. So that's, we're continuously working on increasing that. When it comes to faculty, just to conclude, when it comes to faculty, we have around 450 faculty members, and these are divided into about 250 are professorial rank, and around 200 are instructor rank. These the instructor rank faculty colleagues deal with language instruction, and again, language instruction is not only English, it's mostly English, but it's also Arabic for international students who join the American University. In certain programs require an Arabic proficiency, so there are Arabic language instructors there as well. And about 45% of our faculty members are international. So 55 are Egyptian, 55% are Egyptian, and about 45% are international. So I think I will stop there and continue the conversation in the next two questions.
And I think, Shireen, we're passing off to you.
Thanks very much, Suzanne. So we've already begun to have some of the discussions around the major challenges and opportunities in postgraduate education in your institutions and in your education systems nationally. So I've just got three questions to ask. The first is, we've had a lot of discussion about the push around scale and PhD production in a developing country context in our countries. So the question is, what about research supervisors and well-prepared research supervisors to meet the needs of current enrolled or future students? The second, which I think came to us very much in the fore during the pandemic, is there a sufficient research infrastructure to support PhD level work? And again, we were faced with the issue of bandwidth, laboratories, a whole range of things. But is there an infrastructure? And finally, again, in terms of sort of human capital development needs in our different country contexts, is there an increased demand for postgraduate degree holders by companies, governments, and other organizations in your country? Just if you can reflect on the challenges and opportunities you face, similar to those of other universities in our own national contexts or in the region. So the first was around supervisors, the second was about research infrastructure, and the third was about the demand, increased demand for postgraduate degree holders. Thanks very much.
Who should start?
Sorry. Shall I ask Robert to start? Just we'll go in the same order.
That's absolutely fine. So thank you very much, Sharon. So yes, with the supervisors and how whether we have adequately prepared supervisors to meet the challenge with respect to training 21st century graduate students and particularly PhDs, the answer is mixed. While I think that the quality of the faculty isn't necessarily a problem, there is a problem that borders on the structure, be it the fact that the current student to faculty ratio is very, very high compared to what should be normal, okay, overall. And I mean, so overall in the university, you have a student to faculty ratio of close to a 70. Again, compared to what should be optimal, which should be under 20, right? And so what it then means is that it takes away the time that supervisors have, particularly for research students. We have tried and we have been pushing to try and then tilt the balance in terms of the ratio of the postgraduates to undergraduates in favor of the postgraduates. However, we are a public institution, and sometimes, and with some of the policies of the government currently, there is a limit to which you can push back on that front. And that also means that some of the faculty, even though they are being pushed to try and then engage in research so that they can also then pass on some of these research skills to PhDs, but also learn from the process, they literally have their hands always full. And that is quite problematic, and is one that we at the graduate school are confronted with, and have been trying to institute and insist that the intake of our graduate students are consistent with some maximum number of students per faculty. We are trying to work on that. So generally, whilst the faculty are well trained, I think that there are more structural issues which impact on their preparedness in terms of taking on the graduate training. Research infrastructure is a mixed bag. If you take the centers of excellence, we have some excellent centers of excellence that have funding to essentially procure all the equipment that they need and the reagents, particularly those in the sciences, to undertake the research. But of course, infrastructure-wise, we still are constrained. And so reading rooms for PhDs is limited. Just this morning, I was in a function where Carnegie is supporting the postdoctoral academy to put up a hostel for doctoral students, all in a bid to try and then create a bit more space for the PhD students. So research infrastructure, again, we are a bit limited in that sense. But to be honest, we are not starting from ground zero at all for University of Ghana. We've got quite a good platform to do still important work. Now, the demand for postgraduates, and particularly doctoral students, is very high. It's very high in part because there is a springing up of private universities, and the regulator, the National Accreditation Authority, requires that now for anybody teaching in a tertiary institution, largely your 95% of your faculty must have PhDs, which then means that those who are already in the system who do not have PhDs have had to or are having to come and then gain PhD training. And for some of these people, it is easier, and even if financing is a problem, it's still cheaper to get trained here in Ghana or in the sub-region than it will be if people were to travel to the global north. And of course, for us as well, even though currently we still have a very, very low percentage of international students. Indeed, it's less than 2% of our students are international. We still are getting quite a bit of demand from the sub-region to our postgraduate programs. So the demand does exist. The research infrastructure is generally not bad, but still constrained given the numbers that we have. And in terms of the preparedness of the supervisors as well, I think that it's constrained by a structural issue that is persistent. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Prof. Robert. Over to you, Prof. Fuller.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Now, let me start with the first question that you have raised. This is the question about supervision. Yes, I can say with confidence, I know this because I also operate at a national sector level, that supervision is not just a challenge with regard to our own institution, but it is a challenge of the higher education sector in South Africa. Our own institution, for argument's sake, has got only 36% of its staff members with PhDs, 36%. And you will find that this is a norm across the universities of technologies. Other traditional universities, of course, have got much higher numbers of staff members holding PhDs. Now, growing our own faculty is what consumes us currently, making sure that but now the big challenge is the following, that as soon as some of these academics attain their PhDs or become associate professors, they move to the big 5 universities. This is a big challenge. So it means we've got to massify staff holding PhDs in the sector so that they can be equitably distributed. Otherwise, because research conditions are much better in the top 5 universities, top researching academics will forever wish to work for those particular universities, which is where they get better infrastructure, better support. But of course, we are upping our games in terms of supporting our staff members. The infrastructure challenge, I would say not so very much in regard to my own university per se. Just some 2 years ago, beginning of COVID-19, our own university had released a good sum of a good fund to cater for our infrastructural needs. We are currently engaged in serious infrastructure development programs, and quite soon we will not worry that much about infrastructure. But even before that, in the areas of engineering, in the areas of chemistry and so on, collaboration with and partnership with other universities close by, e.g. the University of KwaZulu-Natal here close to us, has always been the norm. But also you should take into cognizance the fact that we have always sourced supervision capacity from other universities, such as the University of KwaZulu-Natal and other universities of technology, smaller universities, would ordinarily source supervisory support from other research-intensive universities. So this is generally the norm. We are equally utilizing expertise, supervisory expertise from other countries. Lately, we have gone out to make calls so that researchers in other countries can apply and be appointed as associates of the university, and there are rewards for associating with the university, such as publication output points, which translate into monetary income, which they can then utilize to attend conferences and so on and so forth, and for further research activities. Now, there are also infrastructure grants, which South African universities can utilize, especially in the engineering and sciences disciplines. Those would be found with the National Research Foundation, large infrastructure grants, which universities can apply for. You asked, or before I talk about our industry and the employability of graduates, let me talk about the percentage of our international students. Now, we have just gone into international rankings, and the DUT was ranked favorably by Times High, both in the indices for SDGs, but also for citations. And the note that we received from Times High was that our component of the international students was quite limited. Currently, our M&D international sits at only 3%. Recall that our total M&D sits around 8%. Of the 33,000. So that means we've got to do quite a lot of work. But what we have done recently is we have moved into other African countries. We have got presence in Ghana. We are working with some universities there. We are capacity building in the areas of doctoral studies. We've got 2 partnerships in Ghana, 1 in Nigeria. We're working with Kigali, and we're getting huge cohorts of staff members that come from those universities. Now, the interesting part is the following, that students don't have to pay for postgraduate studies. And this is informed by the funding formula for higher education in South Africa. We've got an input and output subsidy formulas, so students don't necessarily have to pay. We can make good money if they can get out of the system as quickly as possible, which is quite fascinating. The only big challenge, however, as I've said, already is that of supervisory capacity. If we had all the capacity, we can accommodate as many students as possible, including from the region, and we would make money out of the subsidy. Now, interesting.
Can I ask you to round up? We've got about 20 minutes to go.
Yes,
so we want to, you've still got a few questions to answer.
Yeah,
from other people.
Just one statement.
Sure.
Interestingly, this morning we're talking about employability of graduates. And we have some statistics about that because we've run surveys among our PhD graduates, our master's graduate, and I can tell you, all of our PhD students are employed students. I think around 45% of our master students are students who are employed. Let me stop it there, Sharon. Thanks.
Prof. Fulu, this is an important discussion. Adnan? Prof.
Fine. Thank you, Shireen. I'll try to be brief because of the time factor. So I'll start with the last question or the last point. Typically, and I'll focus on AUC students because this is where we've done our studies. Typically, we conduct exit surveys with the students that are leaving. A significant number of our students are working while they are actually studying at university. And about 60% of the respondents to exit surveys on a regular basis indicate that having completed typically a master's degree at EUC does result in positive impact in their job, whether they actually obtain a higher position, more responsibilities, and or an increase in salary. So there seems to be, or we take this as an indication that out there is, companies, businesses actually do appreciate a higher a postgraduate degree, not necessarily a PhD, but definitely a master's degree. So that's the third question. The second question is regarding the infrastructure at our university, and generally in Egypt. I will extend that generally. The infrastructure is good. Our 2 PhD programs are in sciences and engineering at AUC. So we did not start the programs until we actually updated the structure to meet the requirements and the expectations of the students. So the infrastructure has, when it comes to facilities, etc., is okay. Generally, the main challenge is the ecosystem. And when I talk about the ecosystem, there are enough faculty members, and I'll come to that. But the ecosystem, when it comes to requirements, regulations, custom regulations, on a national level, governmental approvals and regulations regarding different supplies, equipment. A lot of the equipments and supplies in Egypt are imported from Europe and North America. So the regulations in actually getting the equipment and getting the supplies are, can be more streamlined. That will actually decrease, that would lead to a decrease in the lead time between ordering and obtaining things. So that's maybe one area of, we work on it at EUC, but it's something that needs to be worked on and is worked on at the national level, but it does require further improvements and enhancements. So the first point is supervisors at EUC in Egypt in general, that we have, we have enough supervisors. There are nationally, there are about 126,000 faculty members with PhDs that serve the postgraduate education in Egypt. At EUC, we have not found, or we do not see, we monitor this, we do not see on a general level any lack of supervisors with PhD degrees. All our professorial rank faculty must have completed a PhD. They will not be able to teach otherwise. Maybe the issue that we would like to develop further at our university, and some of the other universities in Egypt also work on it continuously, is even though people might have the technical expertise within technical and academic expertise within their own fields, so they're experts in their fields, typically what would be useful to really further enhance their supervisory skills. Engaging in a supervisory process at the postgraduate level, whether the master's or a PhD, does of course require good technical and knowledge base in the discipline, but also requires other skills, mentorship skills, etc. And this is one thing that we would like to work on further at EUC. Some national universities have actually been working on this longer than us, and some others not. But generally, this is an area that would actually benefit from further enhancement. Thank you.
Very much, Adham. I'm going to hand over to Janet, who will take us through the last 2 questions. It was Stephanie and Suzanne, I think, yeah.
Yes.
Maybe we can take them together, yeah.
Stephanie, you're next.
Thank you. Yes. This is not a question that needs a very long answer, but it's a question about resources. And the question is really about whether we have, as a system or as individual institutions, sufficient resources to enable us to support our postgraduate students. So I'm talking really not only about money, but also about expertise, materials, and so on, and the kind of platforms that we need, and whether or not we have good networks that can give our postgraduates the kind of resources that they need, and our supervisors the kind of resources that they need. Robert, maybe you'd like to start that one. You're muted. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I guess this is sort of dovetails into some of the discussions that we were having earlier in respect of the resources generally. Do we have sufficient resources? Again, I think yes and no. We do have, as a base, we do have quite a lot of PhDs at Eugene. Our staff strength total close to 2,000. About 90% of faculty have PhDs. But of course, and I do support the point that Adham made in respect of being trained to supervise. Essentially, the fact that you have PhD doesn't necessarily mean that you have the right sort of people to actually do the even postgraduate training. I think mentorship is something that we can benefit from. But I think that the networks generally, again, for UG, because we've been around for a while, the networks we do have, but institutional arrangements that enable us to tap more efficiently into those networks, I think is a bit lacking. So currently, for instance, it's not easy to take courses in another university in the current scheme of things when you can actually do lectures virtual. We don't have the current regulatory framework that will enable, for instance, our students to take advantage of courses that are being done, say in Egypt or in Nigeria, and then credit them with these. So again, this is something that we have started doing something by putting a framework for dual degree, joint degree, which embraces all of some of these institutional and regulatory issues, but it still isn't there as yet, and it's something that I think that we need to harness and indeed develop and take advantage of. I think one of the things that COVID has taught us is that we can do a lot more with the resources that we have done, we have been doing, and I think these are the kinds of things which personally I want to see us to be able to better harness. Of course, we have the African Research Universities Alliance is helping in respect of that, but I think that it's not all universities that are part of the African Research Universities Alliance, and so again broadening that platform so that we can better harness the potential that exists even around us, I think would be a very positive thing.
I'd like to take that question also to the other end of the continent and ask Adam how you manage resourcing and resources.
So, I mean, of course, when I talk, I'll briefly talk about this again because of the time. So when we talk about resources, I will not talk about funds, money, because I mean, we always can make use of more money, but other than resources. So yes, so different disciplines at the university are part of international networks, especially in North American networks within the disciplines. So they actually make very good use for that, for faculty research, for supervision of students, even for securing PhD positions at North American universities for our master's students. So that works quite well. We also have informal collaborations, informal meaning that one-on-one within Egypt between AUC faculty members and national universities. So that also for joint supervisions of PhD students and some of the research master students. So that works relatively okay as well. The one thing that we would like to we've been putting some effort on, and we have a couple of successful examples of dual degree programs, and we would like to spend more time and more effort in trying to develop further either joint degrees or dual degrees. It is challenging because of the I mean, we again, it's a US-based system, so it matches perfectly at AUC, so it matches very well with US institutions. But in doing that with US institutions, there is always a need to really be conscious of the fact that that both institutions approach it from sort of an equal needs and equal interest. One issue, of course, we are conscious all the time about and need to really think about is that we do not want to develop programs in which, AUC acts as a feeder institution to institutions in the US. Outside the US, in Africa, in Europe, and Asia, we've looked at and worked on some programs. It's more challenging because of the different systems of counting courses, counting credits, requirements, number of years of studies, etc. And this is one of the things that I think, if we do develop a Pan-African network where we work together on, I think we'll benefit from it very much. But one of the challenges would be the different, historical educational system, the current graduate university or higher education systems in Africa originate from. This is something that we really need to spend time looking at to see how we can better align our systems, our universities, to make better use of, not only collaborative supervisions, but also collaborative courses that can be taken elsewhere, complementary skills, etc. Thank you.
Perhaps I should, rather than ask the question again, just make the comment, because I know we need to finish. But I think the comment is that we need perhaps to think about different kinds of networks. We have the north-south kind of networks, we have the east-west sort of networks, but the Pan-African networks are very difficult too, in terms of shared qualifications and collaborations and so on. And I think perhaps that's a conversation that needs a lot longer at some stage. So perhaps I should hand it back to you, Suzanne. Janet?
I will hand it to Janet shortly, but Professor Fulu, would you like to just quickly reflect?
Well, look, I think it generally depends on the orientation of the institution and what the institution intends to achieve, and also the orientation of those who are leading in particular leadership roles. I personally take this very serious. Now, in our strategy for postgraduate studies, we have got an Africanization perspective. This we deem to be extremely serious. That's why earlier on I was telling you about the partnerships we are making with Kigali, with Ghana, with Nigeria, with Ethiopia, because we aggressively go out to make sure that these partnerships happen. If we don't, we will continue to partner with the colleagues in Germany and in the Netherlands, as has always been the case. We have given ourselves some targets to work with, and I don't by and large agree that there are differences in the education systems, really. A majority of the colleagues that we partner with are graduates of the USA and UK. So we've always found complementarities here and there, and we've always gelled. We haven't seriously experienced challenges. The unfortunate part is that some of the universities that we partner with, unlike the University of Ghana, are smaller universities, up-and-coming universities, even more challenges than the University of Ghana, but they aspire to become big and highly internationalized universities. And I hope and I think that we will get there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have a number of questions from our participants. There's one on partnerships that I think has been covered in the comments that you've provided. And so I will try to get to the ones that are remaining. We have so little time left. Whenever we have such a topic as huge as this, there's never enough time to get to all the wonderful things that people have to share. And so it certainly signals to us that we need to have a follow-up discussion. And so I'm just going to ask one of you to answer each of these questions in the interest of time. So how would you characterize outputs from your PhD students, as this is an indicator of the effectiveness of the PhD in that field? What sort of measures can be put in place to encourage publication and patenting of work emanating from the PhDs. Who would like to take that one?
I think I'm happy to take it. I mean, I'll be very honest here. On average, if you asked me to characterize the output of our PhDs, on average, I think they are very good. On average. But the truth is that they are highly variable. They are highly variable and significant heterogeneity depending on sometimes the academic units they are coming from, but also the factors which drive it. Of course, we can go on and on. So in general, you find that some of our PhDs are publishing in all the top tier journals that you can think of. But the truth of the matter also is that you will find some who really, even for some of us sitting at the School of Graduate Studies, we sometimes wonder how they manage to creep through, of course, and then get the PhD. So generally, I think the PhDs are good. Of course, is there room for improvement? Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think that we can significantly improve on the levels. But on average, I think that I've seen some extremely good PhDs come through the system since I've actually been at the graduate school. And that's for the last 6 or so years. Thank you.
Thank you. And our final question is one that I think is really important. We have a question about universities that are in conflict regions. So everything can be going very well, all the partnerships in place, things going strong students, strong support. And then conflict occurs and the university is devastated and the faculty and the graduate students are scattered. And is there a way to provide support to conserve the research and education that is going on? Who would like to take that one?
Yeah, maybe let me attempt to respond to this particular question. Perhaps if you will indulge me, let me start with the first one. Now, what we have done in as far as outputs and outcomes are concerned is that we've put together a policy that compelled all of our PhD students to write. But not only do we just expect them to write, but we support them in their writing endeavors, putting together writing retreats and orientating them to writing and making sure they spend a week writing, and all that support is being provided. Of course, not all quality, all PhDs are the same quality. Others are a little bit weaker than the rest. And of course, that is the norm throughout the world. Now, in regards to conflict, universities operating in conflict regions, now what we have done here at the DUT is we have a center. It's called a Center for Nonviolence Studies. We are working with the DRC. We are also having students coming from Central African Republic. We've got some students from Ethiopia. They are tackling very interesting questions about the university's operation in those conflict regions, but they're also doing research beyond just the university and its operations. They're looking at conflict resolution at core, you know? So that's a very interesting program. We have seminars all the time, so we are updated about what is going on at the war in Ethiopia and DRC, East and Central African Republic. So I think that universities have got a role to play. We just have to be proactive about it and find partners in those regions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And unfortunately, we are out of time. I want to invite our hosts to give some closing comments. and maybe ponder what might come next. Suzanne?
Thank you, Janet. Thanks, colleagues. I want to be mindful of time you've given us and the opportunity for our next conversation. I think there's a lot of interest and ideas. Stephanie and Shireen, this has been fabulous. Let's continue to figure out ways we can collaborate to promote deeper conversation.
Shireen or Stephanie, any closing comments?
A very quick one. I think the key to making anything like this work is to keep the network open, to keep the communications going, to stay connected, and to not just assume that the communication will continue without being supported. So I think the message is let's stay connected and bring further networks into this.
Yes, just to echo what Stephanie and Suzanne have said, I've been so impressed and thrilled by the robustness and the depth of the conversations, and to see the discussions that are going on in the chat as well. So I hope certainly we look forward to continuing the conversations, especially around the strengthening of our networks, both formally and informally, and generating more knowledge and scholarship, which helps us address the number of pressing development goals and institutional goals that we face in our country context. Thanks very much.
If I can take just one more minute to give a special shout out and note of thanks to Brian and to Matt Linton, who have really been the brains and the energy and the work behind getting this actually to come to fruition. So Brian and Matt, a special shout out to you. Thanks.
Thank everyone for participating, and there will be follow-up information sent out to everyone, and we look forward to the continuing engagement.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, and to the many participants. Thank you.